You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess. The story of Spaceship Earth is simple. We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. Like a spaceship, we have a finite amount of supplies with an intelligent operating system called nature, which keeps everything replenished as long as we all respect it and participate wisely. In this podcast, I'm in conversation with folk involved in regenerating life, shifting consciousness and reimagining how we can live more beautifully and peacefully. I talk with artists, writers, activists, designers, adventurers, healers, farmers, creative mavericks and more. Their stories invite us to participate in the co-creation of life-sustaining cultures, in service to life, becoming crew on Spaceship Earth. Greetings, Earthling. Welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast. This is Dan. Thank you for tuning in and being here. It's much appreciated. As we move into the darker, slower time of winter here in the UK and begin another year, I wanted to offer an episode to reflect on the journey we've been on in the last 12 months in 2024 and the 6th year of the podcast. This is also episode 100. Unofficially, there are about 120 episodes if we include music mixes and experimental episodes which we released during the pandemic, which I forgot to number. But to get to 100 for an ad-free, mainly self-funded podcast in its 6th year feels like something to honour. So this is an episode which I'm calling The Annual 2024. As a kid growing up in the 1970s, I would often be gifted an annual, a physical book, a curation of a year of my favourite comic or magazine at the end of one year. And then I remember actually in the 1990s, the Ministry of Sound created the annual compilation of the biggest tunes of the year. So, taking inspiration from all of that, this is a curation of the highlights of 2024 on the podcast. It features clips, reflections, insights, and learnings from many of the episodes and gatherings. It's not exhaustive, not every guest is featured, but I've included clips that feel to me to be fertile and vital insights for these times we're travelling in. A curation of the year gone by with a nod to what it might be showing us about the future that is unfolding. If you're a long-time listener, you might remember I used to do an episode called Rambling in the Woods, which was basically me rambling in the woods with trees, reflecting on the past conversations. So this is an evolution of sorts. So if you're a regular listener, I hope this captures some of the highlights for you and you might appreciate the reflections. If you're new to the podcast, I hope this gives you a flavour of what we're doing here and inspires you to dig into these conversations and episodes more deeply and jump into the Becoming Crew community. I also hope this annual might bring more support for the podcast in 2025. This will be our 7th year, and we have some new format ideas and so many extraordinary guests, topics and projects to feature. But we really need to find some more support, both financially to cover the increasing costs of creating and distributing this podcast, and also in helping us reach new listeners. So perhaps there might be a sponsor or a funder interested in supporting this project in the coming year. Maybe as a listener you might switch to a paid subscription on our Substack if you have the financial means. Or maybe you might share an episode, spread the word, feature our work, rate and review it on your podcast provider, etc. It all helps. We've always gone about this work quietly, growing organically. But something is shifting. We're reaching more people, and we know that interest in these conversations, ideas and topics is growing. We don't avoid uncomfortable, challenging conversations and topics here. You won't find these explored in mainstream media because the stakes are so high. We are in a lot of trouble as a species. So we're trying to understand more deeply and from different perspectives the context we are in, how we got here, learning to notice and see things differently, to understand the relationality and entanglement of life on Spaceship Earth, to face into the challenges we are witnessing, to respond in new ways, to learn through experimentation, participation and community, and find alternative ways through together with care, connection and kinship with all life. Love for all life. We don't really feature solutionists or those claiming to have the answers, but rather those dedicated to the inquiry, practice, participation, experimentation, transformation, to unlearning and learning and becoming differently with humility, curiosity, compassion, creativity and care at the centre, life at the centre, love at the centre. As modernity continues to unravel and the only systems we've ever known in our lifetime break down, more people are knowing in their hearts and guts that we're being called into profound changes in how we relate to this earth, to ourselves and to each other, how we organise ourselves and how we respond to these accelerating crises. The old divisive binary ways of responding, of thinking and of being, the single story of progress and centralised control are exhausted, expiring. We are stuck. More people are feeling this. Bucky Fuller, systems thinker, designer, futurist, author of Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, whose work, among many things, helped me begin to see everything on this Earth as part of an entangled whole. He thought we were all astronauts, as he said here in 1979.
People say to me, I wonder what it'd be like to be on a spaceship. And I say to you, you don't really realize what you're doing, because everybody is an astronaut. You all live aboard a beautiful little spaceship called Earth.
And it was philosopher Marshall McLuhan who once said, we are all crew on board Spaceship Earth. This idea of crew fascinated me. It spoke of community, adventure, participation and being in service to something bigger and more mysterious. We're exploring a different crew story here, a crew story which sees the Earth as a living entity, an ecological, biological, mythological spaceship. And over the years, I've become increasingly interested in learning from the most experienced crew on board the spaceship. The more than human. The living world, nature as we call it. Because this vast, diverse web of species, beings, bacteria, plants, ecosystems, places and processes that through their own unique participation, interdependence and relatedness create the very conditions for all life to flourish. So here's a thought experiment for you. What if us humans, as the last to arrive here, the youngest species, the least experienced crew on the spaceship, actually had the most learning to do? We need to find our way back into the mysterious operating system of life, to find our own unique roles and responsibilities and duties on board the spaceship that bring us back into right relationship with life on board. Because we are not separate. We are part of the Earth in its complex, ongoing evolution, part of the spaceship itself. So what if the invitation in these times is one of becoming, of unlearning, of ongoing evolution, becoming crew, asking, how do I participate in ways that honour the conditions for life to sustain life where I am? What is my unique role and duty on board the spaceship? What is mine to do? What can I learn from the compost heap, the honeybees, the oak forest? What might the flight of the buzzard teach me, or the flow of the river, or the darkness of the winter? I believe that the future that's emerging is inviting all of us to participate in our own unique ways, with our own unique gifts in pursuit of the health of the whole. It is uncertain. It will require all of us to grow cultures of humility, honesty and care. It will need community and connection, courage and creativity, resilience and rest. It will take joy and grief, unlearning and not knowing, playfulness and localness. That we know for sure. For me, becoming crew is an invitation to step into service and into community with a wider web of life, human and more than human. Recognising that we are part of a living, sentient planet which operates through relationships, interdependence, entanglement, cooperation, experimentation, mystery, and ultimately love. So let us begin. Let's travel through some of the conversations from 2024 and what they are signalling as learnings for the year ahead.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with my dad, Dan Burgess.
I wanted to begin by looking at what we might call the possibilities of non-ordinary experiences. Non-ordinary experiences and the role for these for helping us break out of our cultural stuckness on the never-ending highway of capitalist modernity. How can we feel our way into different futures? How do we unstuck ourselves? How do we wake ourselves up from the numbness of these times, to let go of all that is not serving us anymore? Now, these experiences can take many forms: plant medicine therapies, breath work, dancing, movement, for example. But one that I'm particularly interested in and have explored in several episodes in 2024, have a deep personal and crew practice with, is nature-based rituals and rites of passage. Often in the form of time alone in nature, in a more than human context. This might be through overnight nature solos, medicine walks, or through the longer form vision quest. Guided processes which involve thorough intention setting, community holding and support, ongoing incorporation work, and critically seeing these not as ways to better ourselves as individuals, to better survive in the capitalist economy, but as ways of finding deeper personal and mythic guidance. clues for orienting ourselves through more than human openings in disorienting times, of re-entangling with a living earth, and of stepping into service of the wider community of life with duty and responsibility towards the health of the whole. These are powerful offerings for these times. Ancient practices, they have potential to move us in ways like no other. They can help us through direct experience and connection to feel differently, to encounter a greater web of intelligences, an antidote perhaps to the disconnection and great separation of modernity. I wanted to take us back to episode 81 with David Wendl-Berry. David is an elder and a Vision Quest guide. He was mentored by a number of Native American medicine men in the 1980s and apprenticed with the School of Lost Borders, who really pioneered the Vision Quest into Western culture. He brought that to the UK and has been guiding Vision Quest for over 30 years, this traditional 4-day, 4-night vision fast, and he guided me through my first quest. Let's hear from David about his own Vision Quest experience and why nature-based rites of passage feel so essential in these times of deep transition, uncertainty and change.
And as the days progressed, you slip into a very altered state. And stuff happens that, this one day, I think it was on the third day, I was sitting there just looking out across the landscape, and the landscape was just staggering. It was the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. And I'm just sitting there, and then all of a sudden I hear zzz, and this huge dragonfly landed on my knee. And I looked at it and I said, "Oh, hello." And it looked up at me and it said, "Hello." I said, "How are you?" And he said, "I'm okay, thanks. How are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a bit tired." And he said, "Yeah, I know. I've been watching you for 3 days." And I had this conversation with a dragonfly that at the time felt totally normal. Didn't feel unusual, didn't feel strange, just felt totally normal. So, I had a conversation with a dragonfly. It flies off. That was a nice little encounter. I didn't really pay much attention to it. It was just something that happened. And on the 4th day, I was absolutely exhausted now and deep into the other reality. And I'm just sitting there so exhausted. I'm looking out across this fantastic mountain landscape. And I see this little black dot, very slowly crossing the sky. I looked at it for a while and I thought, what is that? Is that a bird? Is that a plane? What can that be? I couldn't work it out, and I just watched it. And then it popped into my head. I know what it is. It's a golden eagle. You start fantasizing and start creating stories around stuff. So, yeah, it's a golden eagle. So I'm going to call it. So I called Golden Eagle, come and visit me. As soon as I said that, it stopped. It was going like that across the sky, and it just stopped. I thought, hang on a minute. That can't be a bird. It can't be an eagle. Eagles don't hover. I mean, this thing is just standing. It's just in the air. Maybe it's a UFO. I don't know. But then, after about 10 minutes of looking at it, and it's just standing there, I realised it was actually moving. But it was moving towards me. So it was going along, and then I asked it to come and visit me, and it stopped, turned around and came straight towards me. And I watched it for about 20 minutes, and not once did it bat its wings. It flew all directly towards me and went 8 feet above my head. And as it went over my head, I just burst out in floods of tears. It was a huge bald eagle, big white head, black body, and as it flew over me, it just looked down. And as soon as it looked down, it just burst. All these tears just came out, and I don't know whether it was fear, excitement, joy, elation, everything just kind of rushed in. Like all that 4 days was all condensed into that one flight of the eagle that went over my head. And as soon as it disappeared, I packed up to come down, and I couldn't believe I saw it. I couldn't believe it happened. I thought it was a hallucination. I'm hallucinating because I've been fasting for all this time. So I came off the mountain, I saw this young woman going off to the showers, and I stopped her. I said, "Excuse me, you didn't happen to see an eagle fly over yesterday?" And she said, "Oh, you mean that big bald eagle? It was really close." That's when my breath got stuck in my throat, and I thought, oh my God, that was real. I called it, and it came.
Yeah, amazing.
This is insane. These things don't happen to me, you know. But it did, and I came off that vision quest, and I flew. 4 days after that vision quest, I walked back into my cutting room at London Weekend Television, and as soon as I walked into my cutting room, my assistant opened up this film can, and there are 2 big white lines in it, and he said, "Oh, Dave, welcome back. Here." And I looked at it, and oh, great. So I picked up the straw, and I bent down to snort the coke. And just as I got down, I stopped. I put the straw down, and I said, "I don't do this anymore." And he looked at me, and he said, "What?" And I looked at him, and I said, "What?" And it was only in that moment that I realised I was not that person anymore. So if I wasn't that person, who the hell was I? And I realised that, you know, the vision quest is a rite of passage, and it moves you from one stage of your life to the next. This is the next, and I don't know what it is yet, but I knew it's just not that anymore.
David says there is a spirit out on the land that we cannot control or know. The question then is less about what I want to get, and instead, what does the earth want from me? It is said we get what we need in these experiences, not necessarily what we want. And the real work begins after the experience, when we have to work with ongoing incorporation practice with the medicine we've received. Let's hear from another wise human, Vision Quest guide, mentor and artist Natasha Lythgoe in episode 82, who speaks to the mysterious invitation of personal crisis.
This idea that, I guess I'm shortcutting a bit, like crises as catalysts for breaking destructive patterns of self, let's say, or wow. At a bigger level. I mean, let's talk about it. What's the crises all about for you? Why are you so interested in that?
Well, I would say something else. I would say crises might break open. You know, that crises are necessary. They might be necessary as a means of evolving into more mature adult selves. So even when people come on a vision quest, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, a crisis ensues after the vision quest. And the crisis is a necessary step of dismantling what needs to die in order to make room for what needs to be birthed. You cannot birth something without going through the dying to what is no longer alive process. You can't bypass that. And that is often experienced as messy, inconvenient, and usually, inconvenient, messy, horrible territory that we have to. That's why, I bang on and on about the work of incorporation. Because unless we can land the experience of the rite of passage that we've gone through, then it remains a pop-up peak experience in which maybe we had these fantastic moments that remains forever unmaterialized or metabolized through us and into the world. If we can't metabolize it and bring it into the world, then what is the point? Because the whole point is that we are offering ourselves in our healthiest, most mature state and our medicine to the world for the health of the world. And without that key component, it's just another walk in the park.
So, non-ordinary experiences through nature-based rites of passage and rituals. We will continue to explore these in the podcast, and these are very much at the heart of our Becoming Crew action learning offerings in 2025. And you can find out more on our website and subscribe to the Substack to receive news and invitations as we announce them. So, moving on, we've done a lot of exploration in 2024 around noticing and understanding our ongoing entanglement in colonial structures and ways of thinking which have shaped the extractive capitalist systems of modernity and the singular story of economic progress that runs pervasively through us. We're learning fast now through the accelerating polycrisis how these systems and ways of being and knowing are incompatible with the operating system of life on board Spaceship Earth. But we seem to be at loss as to any kind of alternative. As we begin to notice and understand the violence baked into these systems, how they run through us internally as well as around us, what if rather than trying to tweak and change them, we begin to call them out wherever possible? We recognise our entanglements, our contradictions, we recognise our historical and ancestral responsibilities, and therefore our duties to do the evolutionary work in these times. And we begin to learn and practice new ways of relating, being and knowing that will create the alternative cultures that put life back at the centre. So what if the future is more about the how than the what? Instead of arguing about what the future systems are, we focus more on how we show up with ourselves, with each other, and with the living earth. What if the how is the what? This was deeply explored in powerful and profound ways in episode 84 with Alnoor Ladha and Lynn Murphy, long-term activists, political strategists, and in their words, accidental philanthropy advisors. It is these ontological shifts, as they explain, these new and ancient ways of relating, knowing and being, which will birth new systems for human organising. This episode was our most listened episode in 2024 and our longest at 2 hours 20 minutes. It encourages me that there is demand for long form, deeper conversations when we're trying to understand highly complex scenarios that we're in, which have evolved through the actions, belief systems, stories and historical contexts of hundreds of years. Let's hear Alnoor and Lynn speak to post-capitalist realities and healing wealth in times of collapse.
Maybe just to say that, post-capitalism is not just like, it's not a temporal thing, right? And we've touched on this. It's not the thing that comes after capitalism. It's ways of living, being, and relating to the world that are based on values such as generosity, altruism, compassion, interbeing, animism, relationality, solidarity with all life, etc. And we can create these cultures, and that's part of our kind of generational task, is to create these embodied cultures. And we can do that with free people. Embodied cultures can be created with very small groups of people, and that ripples out. And you asked this question around practice. And part of that practice is to be good students of our culture, to really understand the impoverishment of the Western way of living. And I often say to white allies, like, we don't want or need, and it's not useful for white people to collapse into fragility, guilt, and shame. What we need is for white people to claim their ancestry and to declare, I am going to do the redemption work of my ancestors. And that means understanding the structural, historical antecedents that created this moment. If we spent a third of the time studying how the global operating system colonizes our mind, body, heart, soul, psyche complex, that we do reading self-help literature, we would already have a revolution on our hands, right? And then the natural next step of being good students of our culture is to become conscientious objectors of that dominant culture. Like if we want what the dominant culture is selling on tap, if we want the Wikipedia page and the house on Fifth Avenue and all the trappings of capitalist modernity, we are already bought, right? The complex adaptive evolutionary system of capitalism finds the people that best serve its logic and it pulls them to the top. There's no merit system. It's just who's the most willing to do the bidding of capital expansion through greed, short-termism, extraction, appropriation, those who covet status, wealth, power, etc. What the values psychologists would call extrinsic values, as opposed to intrinsic values, which is belonging, being in community, being in service, etc. And so to be a conscientious objector doesn't mean that you fully live outside the system, because we're all enmeshed in globalized neoliberalism. So we may live in an alternative community, but our clothes are most likely made in sweatshops. Our farm truck drives on fossil fuels. We need to get parts from a Toyota factory or what have you, right? It's being a conscientious objector is being so aware and informed by the dominant culture that we are repulsed by it, and we are actively trying to create and enact new, ancient, emerging types of relations. And then part of that is also going to counsel to the more than human world, right? Like we could, as activists, and I've attempted to do this, let's find all the acupuncture points of the neoliberal system and create movements of movements and all of that. And that's useful. And at the same time, perhaps, putting our head to the soil or asking a tree for advice and guidance is as good of a strategy as seizing a communications tower.
What we're sitting with these days is what actually is not just a reconceptualization, and not just a reimagining, but really walking with what actually is wealth, and how do we not just imagine but live another way of being with wealth as a transition pathway, as a way that starts to walk us towards life-affirming systems. And so we're working with kind of starting to move other memes out there in the world that are much more ecologically based. And it's not just about a change of discourse. It's actually pointing to this change of ontology, the change of perceiving reality itself, the change of all of us recognizing what actually is wealth and what is material and what is poverty. And then how we can find I would perhaps say our toxic, often tabooed relationship with money to be with in these days.
And then there's also the question of what archetypal role do you want to play at the end of time? To be a money hoarder at the end of history is a very particular karma to want to take upon yourself, right? And there will be a day the dollar dies. It's baked into the logic of the system. It is a self-terminating algorithm. There's no way around the math and the calculus thing. And then, it's also who do you want to be? Who will you be when there's no money and there's no guns? Who's going to fly their private jets and their submarines? Who's going to man their private islands and their bunkers? People who are growing their own food, and people who are living in community, and people who are practicing indigenous ways of living and being, they're who's going to survive what's coming. And also survival cannot be our motivation for doing what we're doing. It's I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else.
2024 was a year of unprecedented global violence. We have witnessed an ongoing genocide in Gaza, conflict raging in Israel and Lebanon, Ukraine, Sudan, the Congo, among others. And what has been different this time is how millions of us are watching in real time through social media the horrific suffering that so many are experiencing, while our political and media institutions have continued to reject and deny what we can all see if we choose to look. We've witnessed extraordinary hypocrisy and double standards, violent police response to peaceful protest, and the ongoing financial and political support and cover for equipping oppressive powers with military aid and weapons of the most horrific capabilities to destroy human and more than human life. Alongside this, we continue to witness the devastating impacts of climate and ecological breakdown spreading all over the planet, and yet we seem to have become numb to this, or desensitized, in the words of philosopher, writer and post-activist Bayo Akomolafe, who returned to the podcast in episode 97. We had invited Bayo to help us explore the terrain of whiteness, another way of thinking about the dominant logic of these times that has captured our ways of being. There is no one quite like Bayo who sees things and notices things that most of us don't, and who speaks in such profound, beautiful and humble ways. And once you see what Bayo is speaking to, you can't unsee.
Being in a room and someone farts and you squeeze your nose because it's a horrible smell. But over time, I may not be speaking for all of you here. Some of you might give out flagrant, secretions. But over time, you become territorialized in the smell, and you cannot smell it any longer until someone comes in and says, "What's that stinking? I didn't need to use the fart for this, but I wanted to go in there." Right? What's that smell that's in the air? Psychologists have a term for this. They call it desensitization. Right? It's that over time, odorous smells will disappear if you're in the situation of its territorialization. I feel, in a sense, that the world is speaking to us by proliferating, desensitizing monstrosities. We rudely call them cracks or climate chaos or pandemics. But the world is discommunicating. There's this planetary consciousness, this idea that the planet is also speaking. It's not speaking to us as if we're outside of it. In many senses, it's speaking with itself, right? Because we are not on the planet. We are the planet in its ongoing complexity. So the planet is disseminating these monstrous tensions, and they arrive to us as violent disruptions of the normative, or the normal, or the familiar. And then we point our fingers at them and say, that's violent, right? We know in our stories the monster as the harbinger of violence. I want to disrupt that and think instead that monsters, the monster or the monstrous here, I'm not parsing. In my work, I parse between the two, but I won't do that here. The monster is the thing that shows up and introduces us to the violence we're already in, right? It doesn't come with violence or chaos. It shows us we are already in it. We've just become desensitized to the smell of it. That's white modernity. That is whiteness. Whiteness is not, I think it would be a mistake to reduce it to white identified people. Again, there's a tendency within the city, within the ways we're habituated into thinking about bodies, to reduce fields into molecules, to reduce intergenerational matters into individuals. It is a very, very modernizing tendency. It's very reductionistic. We kind of situate it inside the body, inside the person. This is how we allocate agency. This is how we also neutralize intelligence in the world around us, right? So white modernity is not about white people. Whiteness was also the capture of white people. Instead, I think about whiteness and neurotypicality together, right? By neurotypicality, I'm not speaking about a type of brain. I'm not speaking about a brain type. I'm speaking about a tendency, brother, my siblings here. I'm speaking about a tendency to be produced in a certain way. The slave plantations in the antebellum South here in the United States produced slaves. They produced certain kinds of bodies that were subservient to economic imperatives, right? Those bodies that stayed true to the dynamics of the cotton plantation, those dynamics that stayed true to that tendency to produce were good bodies. The bodies that sought freedom, that wanted to escape the imperatives, the logic, the labor of the plantation, were pathologized. There was actually a psychological category called drapetomania for bodies that imagined freedom. So if you were like, damn, I don't want to go to work this morning, I'm going to escape, right? There was a term for that. It was drapetomania, if you have feelings or sensations of freedom. White modernity is the cohabitation, the clearing, the co-option, the captivity of bodies in neurotypical spaces of productivity. Even the ways that we perform activism, the ways that we think about solutions, the ways that we think about solidarity could be a form of white extension. Why am I thinking whiteness here? Because whiteness, took off in the United States as an economic imperative, as a racializing imperative. This imperative seems to be jiving and vibing and waltzing with a larger civilizing ethic. That's why we think about white modernity. A good way to think about it is the neurotypical, right? It's all the ways all of us here are trained to be good bodies, right? It's all the ways we are coached to be successful people. All the times you look in the mirror in the morning and you tell yourself, you can make it. Something like that, you remind yourself that you can do it. You tell yourself, let's go. All those times you pump you're applying for a job, and then this whispering voice, this lurking ghost, this herd of holy ghosts, it's a phrase a brother used recently, tells you to pump the hand that is shaking you 3 times to convey confidence. All the ways that we're properly manicured into maintaining a certain ritual of the familiar. This is the neurotypical. And it is whiteness, right? So whiteness is a territory of acting. We are not bodies within whiteness. We are tendencies deterritorializing or territorializing whiteness. We are not isolated individuals. We are processes. It's very difficult to understand this because most of us see ourselves as isolated, separate, and separable. But instead, I think it is very important, especially now, to notice that you are not separate from the smells in the room, that you are not in traffic, you are traffic. Right? It's not that you are inside traffic. You are the traffic. We are traffic. We are cartographies. We are choreographies. We are ecologies. Our bodies are not neatly and conveniently isolated into rooms or categories or identities or boxes. We are spread out. We are local, but we are also diasporic. So this is my way of starting to think about whiteness as a territory, as a performance, as a co-performance.
There are 2 stories on Spaceship Earth, a passenger story and a crew story. The passenger story is based on extraction, transaction, and distraction, and it's leading us towards collapse. The crew story is based on connection, cooperation, and participation. It leads towards regeneration.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with my dad, Dan Burgess.
Let's talk about practice-driven change. This is how we speak to the work of the Becoming Crew Action Learning Collective and practice community, which has been growing around the podcast in the last 3 years. We're interested in finding different ways through the stuckness, numbness, and limitations of our current ways of responding and thinking about the mess we're in, by practicing new ways of showing up, of being with each other, of understanding ourselves, each other, and our relationship with Earth. We're experimenting with many kinds of practices, ancient and modern, and we invite different teachers and guides to share approaches through our events, gatherings, and courses, and here on the podcast. When it comes to these violent, polarizing times, how do we learn to meet each other, especially when we carry ancestral and cultural stories that tell us to other some humans and some beings, to dehumanize and desensitize? How do we learn to listen deeply to others, even if we disagree with their views, to try to understand each other's perspectives and suffering and the roots of that suffering, and to hold space beyond the binary, polarizing, oppositional stuckness of these times, which manifests across so much of our structures, systems, and ways of organizing? And how do we learn to do this in our own homes and neighborhoods? How do we become active practitioners for peace, seeing all those around us through the same eyes? One of the ways that I've been engaged with over the last few years is the work of the Zen Buddhist monastery Plum Village, set up by the late Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese peace activist who brought engaged Buddhism to the world and the term interbeing as a way of understanding the interconnectedness of life. Over the years, Plum Village monastics have been inviting people from all walks into their practice to teach these ancient ways of being, which have the potential to bring peace into the world. But it is a practice, a verb, a doing, a being, which is all about the power of the present moment. As they say at Plum Village, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. I visited Plum Village for the last 2 years as part of a global retreat of climate and nature activists through the kind invitation of the amazing humans over at Global Optimism. And it was there that I met Lily Cole, guest in episode 89. Lily is an activist, writer, model, and lifelong champion for human and more than human rights. So let's hear Lily speaking to these practices as ways of finding pathways to peace in violent times.
Well, I was just going to riff on actually what I felt like one of the things I got from Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings and the experience at Plum Village was that with the exercise we had to do, we had to imagine we were speaking to somebody we're in a conflict with and really try our hardest to listen to their perspective, imagine their perspective, feel their feeling, so that we might allow some space to emerge for kind of common ground to appear. And so that reminds me too of in this idea of kind of collective empathy, how there's some empathy that comes very easily, for whatever reason, that we have particular sympathies, that some issues resonate, more clearly in our hearts. How would it be if we also try and expand that space? And imagine the experiences or try to feel the feelings for the communities and the cultures and the areas that don't immediately speak to us. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I feel like there's something in his work and in Plum Village's teachings around this point that for me felt very, very hopeful of pathways of peace, both in our own personal lives, the small conflicts that we might find ourselves in life. You can't have world peace if you can't have peace in your house, in your neighborhood, in your immediate kind of environment. So both on the very, very kind of small, local, internal, personal level, that exercise, and then what that would mean on a global global level, for global conflict. But yeah, I find there's a lot in his teachings that, for me, provide me a lot of hope. Pathways of peace in a very, it feels violent kind of time and conflict. So we were at Plum Village early October, and the beginning of the latest outbreak of war in Palestine and Israel kicked off while we were there. It was quite surreal because we didn't have phones or access to the internet. We sort of learned about it in quite a layered way. And then a week or so afterwards, I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh's book, and I came across a paragraph he'd written about having Israelis and Palestinians at Plum Village together and doing work with them, and how through the space of a week and the process that they were sort of going through of deep listening with each other, it'd become possible for them to hold conversations and to start listening to each other, and I can't remember the word they used, but implying kind of some level of empathy was starting to emerge through those discussions. And of course that feels further away than ever right now in some ways, in a heartbreaking way. But I've just been trying to remember that example and those lessons also of how we hold these conversations within ourselves and with our own community, because it's so easy to feel so strongly and emotionally, and we're seeing that emotion play out, and again polarization play out in the conversations around this topic. And I've been trying to practice feeling all those feelings, and also trying to hold some space for deep listening that pushes me sometimes beyond my comfort zones.
We've talked often this year about death, grief, ancestry, and composting our shit. Now, these are not widely discussed topics out in the world. In fact, they often get seen as doomer topics. However, on the contrary, I've become increasingly convinced, as have the collective, that making intentional space for these explorations is essential regenerative practice in finding creative ways through these crises and for cultivating more beautiful, connected and rooted lives that are viable and compatible with life on the spaceship Earth. Because the darkness is essential for light to be light. There is no life without death, no growth without decay, no love without grief, no summer without winter, no beginnings without endings. And of course, we are both carriers of our ancestral stories and intelligences, and our very own actions on Spaceship Earth today, in this moment, will impact our future ancestors, because we are entangled beings, both backwards and forwards in time and space. What if we became curious students of our time, to become active learners and unlearners regardless of our age, to understand through our own inquiries and collective listening where our stories and beliefs that we're holding on to come from, what needs composting and letting go of, and how to practice our way through these vital shifts. Let's hear again from Alnoor Ladha.
And even the notion of blood is part of the scientific materialist fiction, right? There's no such thing as Islamic blood or Christian blood or Jewish blood. Just like there's no such thing as capitalist blood or socialist blood or communist blood, right? Evolution is a very long process. The 4.4 billion year process of the Earth is embedded in the 13.8 billion year process of the universe. Modern anatomical humans, even though we've been around for 250,000 years, our evolution is connected from the very beginning of Gaia, billions of years ago. And so 4,000 years ago, a religion is invented. That does not mean the next day your blood changed. Now, people will say, well, I went on 23andMe or whatever, and, I'm 99% Ashkenazi. All that is a geographical marker that you came from Poland or Ukraine or Germany or what have you, right? That does not mean that your blood has changed because your ancestors had certain beliefs. And so part of our work to do is to really do the redemption work, really understand the decisions our ancestors made, honor them because they were products of their context and their consciousness at that time, and then to become contextually relevant beings and to shift those practices in a way that is true to this moment. And then the last thing to say is this is deeply related to death because we have this death-phobic culture in the West where not only is the role of science the grand unifying theory of everything, but within that is this notion of progress as an arrow that gets ever better. And part of that is longer lives till we can upload our consciousness to the cloud, and then we can become transhuman, AI beings that are, disembodied gods of some sort, right? This is the Silicon Valley, Elon Musk, Zuckerberg dream. And this is the logical outcome of a delusional set of beliefs that actually, as Carlos Castaneda said, live with death as your advisor. Being in deep contemplation, not only of our ancestral lineages and what they've done and, how they had to live probably, 1,000 generations of barely keeping body and soul together for us to be here. We too will die. And the aim is not to perpetuate our consciousness, but to see consciousness as a distributed phenomena. That consciousness does not just lay in the human brain, that it is, that we are embedded within consciousness itself. And this shift in ontology opens up all sorts of pathways of possibility. And so Soma, ancestral pathways, and death are three important areas for contemplation to move us into these ontological shifts.
Vanessa Andreotti, educator and author of Hospicing Modernity and founder of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, and my guest in episode 96, speaks of the need to practice and build our capacities to compost our own shit of modernity, the Western dis-ease of separation as described by her Indigenous partners. And until we create regular, intentional practice for composting, we stay locked in the delusion of separability and the ongoing, self-terminating story of progress. And again, this last year, we have found profound creative fertilizer and possibility in sitting with the grief, shit, and the trouble of these times. Here's Vanessa Andreotti.
Definitely, we also have this teaching about in Western societies, our sense of identity, our sense of belonging, our sense of vitality is dependent on constructs, human constructs that are part of this narrativization of reality and progress and development and civilization. And these constructs are inherently much limited because they have an embedded exclusivity to it. And they say, we can't simply kind of escape from that. We have to deal with that. That's part of the shit we need to compost. Materially, organically, we also have an umbilical cord connected to the spaceship. And this umbilical cord is the actual source of vitality, identity, and belonging. However, we can't, the moment we name it, it's not it. You're back to the construct, the human construct. So figuring out how to have this unmediated experience of this umbilical cord as also an antenna where you receive information from the earth itself, telling us what to do, basically.
Right.
And designing us as beings that are tethered to everything within the metabolism of the spaceship of the earth is extremely important. So for them, the disease of separation or separability is a terminal disease. It's it's a neurobiological impairment that is degenerative and that leads us to turn on each other, basically for perceived entitlements and pleasures and enjoyments that have nothing to do with the viability of life of the whole and the long-term viability of this life. So figuring out how to move us from this setup of pleasures into a setup of different kinds of joy, right? Of being together. And there's joy in encompassing shit. Well, what Bayo would call it's an issue movement, the trickster move.
Yeah. A shape shift.
A shape shifting that needs to bypass the defenses of the ego.
When we have a reciprocal relationship with the more than human world, we can work with our grief much more intentionally and creatively if we choose to do so. Let's hear from Dr. Ros Watts from episode 79, one of the most prominent voices and minds in the field of psychedelic research and founder of ASA Integration, supporting people to connect more deeply to self, others and the natural world with a specific interest in trees. Ros explains connecting with the rowan tree and a time of grief.
For the tree of February, it's the rowan tree, which grow everywhere. It's my favourite tree. It's also called the mountain ash, and they grow often on the edge of mountains in very precarious rocky places. They're really resilient trees, and you can tell them because in winter they have bright orange berries, and every berry has the pentagram, the 5-pointed star on their base, which is a sacred symbol of protection. So in our community, rowan is the tree of love and grief. And that's because we come to the rowan tree in February, it's Valentine's Day. But the time when we meet the rowan tree in our community is when the last berry has fallen. So in the winter months, imagine it being snowy landscape, which it always would have been snowy before climate change, in this part of the world. And the rowan tree was called the wayfarer's tree because it was the last colour in the winter landscape. So they would plant rowan trees in important places so that people could navigate the landscape by the red berries. They'd be like a beacon of flame. And they would be full of berries until about kind of January. But when you meet the rowan tree in February, it's a symbol for the last bit of hope, the last bit of guidance, the last bit of colour in the landscape has gone. The berries feed the birds in the winter. It's like this, benevolent source of warmth in the cold. We meet the tree when the last berry have fallen and the branches are bare, the landscape is bare, there is no food, and it's a time of hopelessness and grief. So in our journey with the rowan, we meet the rowan tree, and it's hard to find the rowan tree, which is the rowan, because it's got no berries. So it's that sense of loss, being lost, no way home, don't know where we are, complete hopelessness, no berries, no way of even finding this damn tree. It's this absolute moment of the worst moment, the darkest night the dark night of the soul. And then in our journey with the rowan, we imagine that we find the rowan somehow, and usually by scrabbling around in the dirt, and there's some composting rowan berries. And then you imagine going down through a tunnel, down to a cave underneath the rowan tree. And in that cave, there's a tiny fire in the corner, and there is one glowing ember. All the fire has gone out apart from one ember. And you go down and you sit by the fire, and then there's a guide there. It's the rowan protector, who is the spirit of the rowan tree that sits there in the cave all year long and says to you, you need to blow on the ember to bring the fire back. Even though it's cold, the cave is dark, it's wintry, you have no hope, you're full of grief. Your grief teaches you about your love and what you most care about and want to protect. And that ember is a light with that last drop of care and hope that you have to bring something of love and connection back into this world. So you blow on the ember, you get it to light again, and it's a kind of symbol for bringing the warmth back into the cold, hopeless landscape.
We've been digging deep into relationality on this podcast and through the Becoming Crew community gatherings, renewing our understanding of our existence with life as relational beings, not separate selves, as part of an entangled web of life, seeing the crises we are experiencing as largely due to ways of relating, of perceiving our human selves on board the spaceship, which we're now understanding to be not only destructive, but also not true. For the majority of our existence as a species on this earth, wherever it was that you called home, we saw life as animate, sentient, sacred, entangled, mysterious. This separation logic of modernity, where we see humans at the centre and nature as a resource over there, has happened in the blink of an eye when we consider our evolution in Earth time. Literally no more than a cosmic wing flap. 2024 saw the passing of Dr. Stephan Harding, deep ecologist, author, deep time walker, co-founder of the world-renowned Schumacher College, and someone who spent his life expanding our Gaian consciousness, that we are part of an ancient, ongoing, self-organising, self-regulating, complex living Earth. He impacted so many humans who are now working towards Earth-centred cultures. I was taught by Stephan in 2010, and he helped me see life in new ways, to see Earth as alive. Here's Stephan on episode 60, which we re-released in 2024 to honour his passing, helping us understand the Gaia story and the sacredness of this extraordinary planet we call home.
Well, there's many different aspects to Gaia. If we look at the concept of Gaia historically, we have to go back towards the ancients, to ancient Greece. Let's stop at ancient Greece, although you can go further back into ancient India, which is probably where the notion of Gaia came from. But let's just go to ancient Greece. For the ancient Greeks, Gaia was the firstborn of primordial chaos. You see, so she's a real mythological deity. She's a deity, and she's mythological, and she's the first created material thing, first created material being that has come out of this vast, formless, matterless intelligence, which the ancient Greeks called chaos. It's very mysterious. We can't understand it. I don't think they could either. This sort of great potentiality to become, but it hadn't become. It was an intelligence that hadn't become but wanted to become matter. And perhaps it pondered and pondered. Perhaps there was no time, no space, but anyway, for ages and ages. And eventually it realized that the best thing it could become was the deep-breasted earth, as the ancient Greeks would say. And out of chaos came Gaia. Didn't have any animals or plants or humans on her at that point. It's not clear what she did have, but anyway, soon the sea arose, and then eventually she gave birth to the sky, to the stars, to the cosmos. So you see how primordial Gaia is. She gave birth to the cosmos with all the stars and the planets and the sun, and then she mated with Uranus, which is the cosmos, with the universe of stars and planets and the sun. She mated with her own son. And out of that came all the animals and the plants and eventually the humans, and of course the gods and the goddesses, various echelons and races of gods and goddesses. So that's who Gaia was for the ancient Greeks. She was a divinity, more than a goddess, a divinity. She was the mother of all the gods and goddesses. She was the mother of all, the mother of everything, and the steadfast base of all things, as Hesiod wrote about 500 BC when he wrote down these ancient myths of Gaia. So right at the center of our culture, we have this idea, this perception that the earth is a sacred divinity, firstborn of primordial chaos. And this is deep in our unconscious, you could say. Because of course what happened later on was, say around about the time of the scientific revolution, particularly, but even before that actually, this mother goddess, Gaia, the mother goddess, was basically repressed, and we were cut off from her. It wasn't just in the scientific revolution, it happened in the Neolithic, long before the scientific revolution, maybe about 4,000 years ago.
The transactional view of what our culture today calls nature, the environment over there, good for resources, looks nice, good for my well-being, which Matt Barr, journalist and host of the Looking Sideways Adventure Sports podcast, spoke to in episode 83 from the perspectives of outdoor sports communities. This was a prime example which illustrates our stuckness in the transactional worldview, the illusion of separateness, of nature as inert, a resource over there for my enjoyment. To shift beyond that, to create a future politics and policies and ways of organising that recognises the more than human world as sentient, alive, animate, to see ourselves in kinship with all life, as part of nature, not apart from nature, and all life, therefore, as sacred. That will only happen if more and more of us step into these ways of remembering, of seeing and knowing, into deeper relationship and guardianship with the living world around us in the places we call home, to speak up and out unashamedly of this sacred entanglement of life. Let's listen to the legend that is activist, lawyer, river guardian and rights of nature campaigner Paul Powlesland from episode 98.
I hold my river to be sacred. And you can't argue with that. I will do whatever it takes to peacefully protect and restore my river. And I don't care if that breaks any law that you have. Do what you will with me. I will restore this river regardless of what you say, regardless of what you do. Always peacefully, but not necessarily lawfully. If you try and stop me, I would go up and to whatever I have to do, including my own life, to protect and restore that river. And there's a power to that. And there's a power telling people that and being really, really obvious about it. Let us not hide our sacred and spiritual connection to nature anymore. Let's be open about it and defy them and dare them to do what they will with us if we hold by that deeply sacred principle that we have.
"2024 was a year where the UK justice system handed out the most severe sentences ever to non-violent climate protesters. Research shows that the UK police now arrest environmental and climate protesters at 3 times the average global rate. What an insane reality we find ourselves in, as every leading climate and Earth system scientist sounding the alarm bells about the accelerating collapse of our Earth system, the vital organs of our spaceship, with more of us witnessing firsthand the devastating impacts of climate breakdown, and yet still those protesting non-violently on the streets are being locked up. How history will look back at these times. So what if, as part of this shift to recognising the earth as a living entity, to seeing all life as sacred, to be in kinship with all life, to live with some responsibility for our future ancestors, what if we saw the selfless sacrifice and humility of non-violent protest from frontline activists as a sacred act, as a spiritual gesture to all life on this earth? Clare Farrell, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and guest in episode 94, offers us some reflections on non-violent activism and its crucial role in opening space for urgent societal dialogue. She encourages us to look at these courageous acts with more compassion and to question critically the media narratives that demonise these brave humans.
Non-violent action, it creates space where there isn't any. And until you undertake the action, the space for that conversation doesn't exist. And when you take the action, bam, you've created a big open space where that dialogue can happen. And it doesn't just open up a conversation that's possible about the thing that you use on your poster or your banner or the message of the action or whatever. It also can open up some very much more nuanced conversations, which then go on and on and on about what is the law here to do? What can't it do? Why can't it do it? Why is it not helping us to protect ourselves and each other and our children and people around the world and our human family? Why is it so slow? Why can't it catch up with reality? All of those questions. And so for me, the beauty of understanding like well-crafted non-violent action is actually to realize that it begins the process of dialogue that you think has to happen. And as someone who has not got very much resources, it's one way that you can ensure that conversation begins, because you know that it's critical. But go back to the original point about not knowing and not being certain. It's also not seeking to be the final word on a matter. It's not saying we know everything, this is what it is. It's saying we desperately have to have this conversation, and I'm willing to be locked up and lose my liberty and take a great personal cost in order just to start a conversation. And I think, if people could understand the humility and the generosity of non-violent activists now, rather than what the media tells you about people like us, which is, that we're all called Tarquin, or we're all posh, or we're stupid, or we're too educated, or we think we know better than everyone else, or we're the enemy of the working class, or we're blah, blah, blah. And the list can go on. And it's very sort of paradoxical list of things. They're completely contradictory list of things. But if people could understand the spiritual generosity of the people who undertake direct actions that give them like serious life consequences, like being put in prison, we could be having a much more constructive conversation about the things that we really need to be talking about. And again, to go back to that Atlas think tank conversation, or sort of, the opposition having strategies and tactics too, been hugely successful element of the opposition strategy to other activists, to the point where it's very difficult for people to engage with them as human beings. And by dehumanizing your opposition, you undermine everything that they can possibly say. So rather than argue with what they're saying, it's much easier to just destroy their identity and undermine who they are as a human being and dehumanize them. And I would say that's their strategy. And they've been hard at work, not just here, but in other countries around the world. And it has been successful because we have a completely cooperative media landscape, basically. Like almost the entire media is happy to work with them on that strategy, either knowingly or not knowingly. And it's extremely challenging to work in that environment.
Finally, let's hear from folk musician, activist and artist Sam Lee, who reminds us in episode 80 of the power and possibility of music and song in connecting us back into sacred relationship with the lands we are part of.
Well, I think the thing that I'm song dreaming, to answer your previous question, is really about is this kind of idea of how do we bring music in the sense of ceremonial, personal, directed, but also collaborative way that we connect to the land. And actually, it's kind of laughed at. It's a laughable thing, this idea of song dreaming. It's a kind of neologism that I've created as a kind of British version of the song line or the dream time. It's a quality that we have had for sure in this country for a very long time, and has been crushed and destroyed. And we're just seeing the last remains of that through folk song evaporate. So we're in this kind of interesting time of complete separation from the ancient world. So now's the time to reimagine actually what can that relationship be like when one puts aside cynicism and, embarrassments and that sort of thing. Actually, how has song been such a vital part of our connection process and our allegiance to the land, of which it is so strongly in so many cultures still to this day.
Yeah.
That's like that's a really powerful idea if we're able to start to kind of connect in with what does that as a prayer, what does music as a prayer, and how can we use our folk songs adapt because they've been secularized so much, but actually start to rethink about them as a means to communicate and to tune in, as kind of blueprints, as maps, as guidance, as orientation to our own personal, individual senses of correspondence and journeys into loving nature, and also duty of responsibility and care that comes with that.
We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. How bonkers is that? You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
If you'd like to support the running of the Spaceship Earth podcast, head over to our Substack and sign up. You'll get every episode straight to your inbox, weekly writing, plus other crew offerings. We're grateful for whatever you can give. Join us at becomingcrew.substack.com. So let's talk about the task and practice of imagining alternative futures. Cultivating our imaginative capacities to bring about alternative futures is a steady thread on this podcast and in the Becoming Crew community. How do we imagine different realities and then bring them into being? What is the source of our creative inspiration? The wellspring for our imaginations. We're especially interested in connecting with Earth, patterns, ancestry, mythology, spirituality, growing ecological and collective imagination capacities, feeding new forms of imagination and doing it together in community. This might also mean needing to go back in time to remember things we've forgotten or dismissed to help us find new ways of imagining alternative futures, as Adah Parris, futurist, visionary artist and activist, reminds us in episode 85.
And so it just felt like I was recognizing all these patterns. And it got to a point where I actually gave it a name, and it was cyborg shamanism. And I can explain more about why that was later. But I gave this stuff a name. And so I was asked in this podcast to write a manifesto for women. And I went, well, we have to start by remembering who we are. And remembering that we are part of everything and that what we are creating is creating us. And so I wrote this cyborg shamanism manifesto for women that talked about there is no one way of being a woman, that we are, as women, we are usually measured in relation to somebody else, so daughter, sister, mother, not Adah. And that we have been the architects and the technologists and the futurists and the creators of nations and systems and structures. And if we don't remember that, then we continue to be lost.
Let's hear again from Clare Farrell on the role for culture and artists in these times to help us imagine differently, to feel differently, to move into a different paradigm. Here explaining the work of Hard Art Collective.
Hard Art started because I went with a friend and they introduced me to Brian Eno, who's been fantastically supportive and generous with us. And we were talking about a kind of fresh, not totally new, but like a fresh analysis of the landscape and the situation and what might be possible and perhaps what we should lean into. And this idea that, it's a cultural problem that we face, as well as a political one and an economic one and da-da-da. And actually, how do we generate the kind of cultural sort of network and collateral, if you like, that can really take us forwards into like a different paradigm of politics and the way that we organise ourselves in society, and the way that we think of ourselves, and the way that we know ourselves and who we are, who we want to be. And a big focus of what we've done is looking at assemblies, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, how we might facilitate and support a shift away from what you've said, like, very centralized, very stuck, very to ever make a dent in kind of these huge sort of monolithic structures that seem very, very difficult to challenge. But how can culture change the context that we're working in, and how can it change the context in terms of, supporting activism, supporting climate action, but importantly supporting this kind of reimagining of the world, and particularly of the way that we govern ourselves. And I think, one of the things that we came up with at the sort of early stages was, how can we help one another to create a network that's dedicated to helping to defibrillate the imagination of the general public and of ourselves, to really, like we said at the start of the podcast, like believe that there's other things that are possible and that we might just be able to make them ourselves, that we believe in the deep kind of essence of basic goodness of people, which I think runs totally counter to the sort of pervasive narrative of human greed and competition and, all of the things that are designed into our systems that people then have taken as rote, that's just the human condition. We're basically selfish. We're not very nice to each other. We fight each other, and all of that stuff. How can we support a kind of transcendence or a sort of lifting out of the sort of the drudgery, actually, and the impossibility of that kind of space, both intellectually and philosophically and spiritually, and like go into a place of like wild, beautiful imagination that says like, we could make the world differently, we can do things differently.
So what other things might we consider when exploring pathways to alternative futures beyond the binary? What if queering was an approach to change? Any idea what I'm talking about? Let's listen to the incredible Jasmine Qureshi from episode 90, journalist, marine biologist, queer ecologist, poet, writer and storyteller.
And at the beginning of these workshops, I tend to ask people, what does queer mean to you? What comes to your mind when you think of queer? And a lot of the answers are very different, but they're very interesting. So people have said things like different. It means different to me. Oh, it means gay. It means something sexual. It means space. It means colorful. It means odd. It means, different than the norm. And these are all right. They're all correct. They're all correct answers. Because the thing about the word queer is that it's developed as an identity. And I reference myself. I identify with the word queer. But the reason it's developed, I see it for myself as being a very vague but very umbrella term. It contains a lot within it. It contains a lot of feeling. It contains a lot of people. It contains a lot of history, but it also contains a lot of different definitions. And I think that makes it the most useful for what I'm about to talk about, because its fluidity and its ability to be shaped by the personal interaction that someone has with it makes it a perfect vehicle for change, because it makes it a perfect vehicle to be liberation, to be liberational or liberative, if those are even words, or to liberate yourself from a system that is quite normative, that is quite linear, that is quite systemic and structured. And so when you have a word like queer, if people answer lots of different answers and they say lots of different things, I tend to go, well, actually, you're all right. And I'm right as well. Because again, your definition of queer is very personal. And so kind of sticking with that, when I look at queer ecology, I'm not really looking at a subject. I'm not really looking at something that, queer ecology is its own subject and therefore it should be standing alone, or it should be collecting lots of definitions and facts and structures within itself. Because I view it more as an interaction with a subject. I think the queering of ecology is probably more accurate. I mean, we can use whatever definitions we want because, like I've said, definitions, they change all the time. And we know that labels throughout history change meaning because it's language, and language changes almost every second with the different ways that people use it. and the interactions that they have. But with queer ecology, again, it is that interaction with the subject. And interestingly, the person who coined the term, Dr. Katrina Sandilands in 1994, I think it was, that's very recent. And they coined the term queer ecology. And they meant, well, they said they meant in the piece that they wrote, that queer ecology deals more with the queering of nature and the undermining of what we believe nature and wild to mean. And I thought that was really interesting, because within that, what she has done is basically said, it's an undermining of normativity. It's an undermining of previous structure. And I view queer ecology as that. It's the breaking of biology. It's the breaking down of ecology, because it's looking at the facts. It's looking at the data that is so foundational to ecology and biology. It's looking at those things and going, but why are they foundational? Why are they things that exist? And how can we further break them down, not so that they are erased and never exist again, but so that we understand where they've come from, who came up with them, and what were the influences there? Because if you do that, then you tend to understand everything going forward. And biology and ecology in particular are subjects and sciences that most policies are based on. We base a lot of societal fact on biology. We change a lot of laws because of biology. We change a lot of our assumptions about people in the world because of what we know, in quotations, about biology. And we do that based on what we've been taught. And so if we can break down why we've been taught these things in biology, if we can break down these structures that are said to be absolute in biology, then perhaps we stand a chance of breaking down a lot of the toxicity that exists in society, which I think is so necessary, especially, again, as someone with my identity who's grown up facing a lot of that toxicity and that structure.
So to wrap up this riff on imagination, here's artist and educator Azul Carolina Duque from Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures in episode 99. Azul offers us a provocation, a watch out to consider about the colonisation of our imaginations, and maybe another way to think about what next.
One way in which we've come to relate to colonialism or to modernity or to all these entities is as a degenerative disease, which has limited the ways we can imagine, we can relate, we can think, we can heal, we can desire. It has co-opted our neurobiology to such a degree where most of the things that we can imagine are probably different versions of the same house of modernity, probably with like different walls or different internal architecture, but still within the same limits. But this conversation around imaginations is something that I am also very, very interested in. And the amount, what we've been focusing on is we were talking, Dan, about our addictions to teleology. So telos means screen, as in like projecting. So in this culture, we are addicted to seeing the endpoint in order to walk towards it. And that's what teleology refers to. Or one of the definitions is only until we can imagine the thing, only then we can walk towards it. But again, because we don't even come to understand how colonized our imagination is, and this is what our indigenous research partners tell us. You know, every time they see people, most of the times they see folks working on radical imagination, whatever, all they see is it's the same thing, folks. It's like Eduardo Galeano, who was a poet, poet in Latin America. He said, this is a very superficial example, but it's a really good one, which is, capitalism versus communism. It's like you're asking a chicken, do you want to be cooked in red or in white sauce? It's the same freaking thing. Really, like the changes are minimum in the way we relate to each other, to time, to ourselves, to our psyche, to dreams, to capital, to politics, to everything. And so this is just a very, very superficial example, but it really helps us see that our imaginations have been dangerously colonized. So perhaps instead of imagining the thing we want and we desire in order to walk towards it, what if we try to do the unlearning composting work and get out of the way for the thing to emerge. And this is a lot of the emergent work of not knowing what's going to come, but developing a vital compass that helps us take the most responsible next step in every situation, where we're doing what needs to be done, not what we want to do. And we are incredibly, incredibly smart at masking what needs to be done. Masking what we want to do as what needs to be done. So again, it requires an enormous amount of hyper self-reflexivity, of honesty, of humility, and of humor to be able to see ourselves as both cute and pathetic in the work we're doing.
I want to speak to localness, to the places we call home, to our little patches on Spaceship Earth. What if local might be the thing calling for our attention in 2025? And a question we're holding in the collective: how might we become native to our places again? Bucky Fuller could see the design of localness and local participation as a critical part of the regenerative universe. Here he is again in 1979.
And that in order to have a eternally regenerative universe which is 100% efficient, you'd have to have then some local information gathering and some local problem solving in the terms of the fundamental design of that universe itself. I say humans have been given that capability. Quite clearly, we've been able to go out and get that information 11.5 billion light years around us. That we are here for local information gathering, local problem solving, in respect to the maintaining the integrity of an eternally regenerative universe.
When the world at large can feel so overwhelming and systems impossible to shift, what does getting more deeply rooted and embedded into the places we call home look like? Let's listen to the extraordinary Immy Kaur of Civic Square in episode 88 speak to the neighbourhood as critical demonstrators of future regenerative realities. Civic Square's mission is demonstrating neighbourhood-scale civic infrastructure for social, ecological, economic and climate transition. I'm a huge fan of their work. They're pioneers in the UK when it comes to showing what communities can achieve when it comes to responding to some of the gnarliest, complex systemic issues we face as a species. They use practical, decentralised approaches, translating complex system change thinking into participative inquiry and co-design projects, working with place-based communities alongside diverse practitioners, knowledge and wisdom holders, and regenerative innovators.
This really matters because I think that when you look at where we are now, I think we know that nothing other than a complete distribution of as much tools, resources, skills, spaces, connections to the level of our neighbourhoods to rebuild our planetary and human and more than human health is critical. And so our work is situated in that space of like, what is the future public goods, right? What are the things that are the moment that goes beyond all of the niche and beautiful, and how to demonstrate what needs to change in what we call the dark matter, our relationship with the land, our governance, the way we design finance, our relationship with monetary layers of that work, knowing that capitals can be many and broad and not just financial. And so this is at the moment at the heart of our work in terms of demonstrating what a lot of that looks like. And again, I wouldn't necessarily say it's just new. It's like this weird tension between all that we've known for generations, that our home streets and neighbourhoods are where life happens. The best of how we dealt with the pandemic was realised there. It's where mutual aid happens. It's where the world scoops you up. It's where imagination happens. It's all those things. This is not new. You know, I could see like my grandma being like, "Oh God, you guys are just realising this now?" Like, and it's like not necessarily to do with us, right? Because the powers that have also been like forcing a very different story upon us have been substantial and insidious.
Regenerative farmer and permaculturist Hamish Evans from Middle Ground Growers reminds us in episode 98 of our entanglement with the lands we live on and this pivotal invitation moment to shift our identities so that we might become beings of place, custodians of place, and evolve towards movements of bioregional projects and deeply diverse local cultures.
The biggest one for me is this kind of what we've talked a little bit about is like the disempowerment thing. Like we've been told we're consumers or even citizens doesn't quite do it. You know, we're like custodians and we're like beings of place and we're like collective beings and feeling beings. We are the river. That's why this We Are Avon thing is like we are Avon, like we are this valley. And it may seem like a long way off to feel back into that, but I think the biggest barrier is like this disempowerment. It's like, oh, we just wait for the systems to like hand us down some River Protection Act, or we wait for the government to change and then do this thing that will help the river. And like we need all those things, of course, but I think they're only going to come about if we actually play into a different narrative that empowers us to come together and actually begin to do some of these things in our place and do it in the lands that matter to us, around us, and build it from there. And the sort of broader vision for this is this bioregional movement. It's already happening as well in lots of different pockets, lots of amazing work, but it kind of ripples out. So it'll be bioregionally context specific, but different bioregions working on these kind of regenerative projects, region by region, basically, and building together with this really strong, beautiful movement of empowered people and custodians of place. Yeah, it's a shift in identity. I think that's the biggest barrier. Yeah, identifying ourselves as nature, as custodians of the land, as people that can actually do this and come together. There's countless examples, like you said, that we can make those changes and shifts. So yeah, I invite you all to like join in, and everyone's weaving in ways already. But yeah, really get involved.
Wendl-Berry once said, "The only true and effective operator's manual for Spaceship Earth is not a book that any human will ever write. It is hundreds of thousands of local cultures." I think Wendell has nailed it. I want to speak of the young in our lives, the youth on Spaceship Earth. We've often tried to feature younger generations in the podcast to make space in our Becoming Crew offerings for younger folks. And we're working on our first youth learning programme launching in 2025. A few years back, in episode 56, I reflected on how it seemed that most species, as far as we can tell, centre their young, appear to put the young at the centre, to listen, nurture and protect the young seem to be a core foundational practice of life on Spaceship Earth. We're deeply troubled by where the younger generations are finding themselves, trapped into these destructive, unravelling systems of modernity, the impossible story of individual economic success, as they witness spiralling debt and costs of living, automation of jobs and uncertain career paths, an overwhelm of disinformation and divisiveness, growing eco and climate anxiety, social media toxicity and pervasiveness, and poor mental health. And with all of this not being given the space, encouragement, support and trust to explore other possibilities and pathways. And I know that I'm not alone in this feeling. Bucky Fuller put his faith in the young to make the shifts to a more regenerative world back in 1979.
I say, I know we have the option to make it. I think our time is very short. I think if we're going to make it, it's going to be by virtue of youth and truth. But really the most extraordinary thing about that young world is all worlds. I mean, that feeling you had of being loved. And the extraordinary feeling you have of suddenly loving. So the young world knows that stones don't love stones, that there's something incredible in the world of love. So I find that young world, nobody's saying to them, get over your sensitivity anymore. They're really guarding their sensitivity. So they much more integrity, daring to really go along with what they see and what love tells them. So say if we do make it on a planet, I know we have the option. It's going to be by virtue of the fact that the youth loves truth, and the youth abhors all hypocrisy. So there's going to be love of truth, of youth. We may make it. Thank you.
But here we are 50 years later, and what I've been learning is we cannot leave this to the young. What if we have to do this together, intergenerationally, to create spaces that are intergenerational by design, so that we clear space together for something new to emerge that has love and care for all life at the centre? Processing and composting the toxic, destructive ways, the stories that divide us, the ways of seeing that separate us, the ways of being that dehumanize, learning to reconnect with our bodies and the land, supporting our young to evolve and become differently, bringing back the practices of eldership and rites of passage to guide us into service and responsibility for all life on Spaceship Earth. Imagine that. Let's hear again from educator, author and activist Vanessa Andreotti, who really gives deep insight to the context for intergenerational responsibility in these times.
The kind of processing that happens in intergenerational sharing is when you are listening to different people talking from different generations or from the same generation without you having to be the speaker, right? It's a place where you can actually process what's happening without the pressure on you, right, to respond. So we've lost that. That is the thing, this processing time, right, of listening to other people talking and processing things is how we used to process as well. And now we have the technology addressing you directly. Right? You are always on the spot to respond. So in many ways, that has also conditioned this younger generation or the incoming generations to be very much of the standard. And that creates other problems in terms of perceived entitlement and how they perceive agency and power and voice. So it is challenging because we've never had this before. We've never had that whole generation having their primary relationship established through social media or their primary perception shaped by a screen, right? It is new. Some educational philosophers talk about it as like in the future, we will look back and we will see that this was child abuse, right? To deprive people of or to channel all the attention into one mode of perception and communication. So there are challenges. I see, as you see, an easier move into discussing more complex issues, but I also see a difficulty in being, but there is a yearning for being in the body, but also a difficulty in coming to that. I witnessed a group of the students in the protest having a conversation. And I could see like them redirecting each other towards depth and towards this embodied intelligence. And I thought that was extremely inspiring, that they have the direction, they have the yearning, but this yearning can be captured by algorithm and it can be weaponized in different directions as well. So instead of, I see a lot of people also romanticizing, idealizing the students, which is problematic. What I tend to do in this context is to say, look, we need to talk about intergenerational responsibility here. And the first step of the intergenerational responsibility is us learning to compost our own shit, right? And not socializing down the line of generation unprocessed shit. So the legacy we can leave is new soil once we process our own stuff. So we have to think about legacy very differently. And it's interesting because the kinds of stories that younger people now need to hear are not the stories we're ready to tell. because we haven't processed them yet. So, for example, hearing about the protests in 1968 would be extremely useful, but not in a heroic way. We need to learn the messy bits, what didn't go well, what the mistakes were, what context was there that isn't right now. So we need a much more humble storytelling that generally people from that generation are not like it's either an idealization or a vilification. We need to get out of the narrative of villains, victors, and innocent deserving victims to be able to get into the messiness of it, which is what they now need to process, right? Otherwise, they will feel powerless and latch on to very simplistic answers that they don't know the second and third order implications of, right? That create more, may have a potential, that has a potential to create more harm.
So we're coming to the close of this Spaceship Earth Annual 2024, and I want to finish by speaking to this invitation of becoming crew. We believe that the future is about crews, of collectives and communities, of human and more than human life. The time of hyper-individualism and the atomized separate self is ending. The time of the lone wolf is over. As Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh once predicted, the next Buddha will be a Sangha. We are not alone. It seems we never have been. Let's hear how some of our guests this year respond to the invitation of becoming crew. Here's Alnoor Ladha again.
I'd say, fortunately and unfortunately, we are crew, regardless if we are identified with that or not. We are entangled, and none of us are free until all of us are free, as the abolitionist saying goes. And this Ilya Prigogine idea of islands of coherence is non-dualistically important, and simultaneously there's going to be no islands within the Gaian Enteleki and the Terran whole. And even our gut biomes are occupied by 90% so-called alien non-human bacteria, right? Our ancestors are living through us epigenetically and through the 93% of our DNA that scientists call junk DNA, right? There's electromagnetic resonance ancestrally. We're entangled with every human being, and more than human we interact with. It changes our neural pathways. Our ecology is determining the quality of our life. The food we put into our belly through the vagus nerve is determining the quality of our thoughts. And so really the question is, what archetypal roles do we want to play as crew members in the Gaian whole?
And folk singer and activist Sam Lee.
I like this. And I'm also thinking this very much from the Bristol point of view, which has birthed this idea, becoming crew idea. It feels like such a of your land. And how can that spread? How can that idea of the concepts of what does communality mean? How can we work in ways, live and exist in ways that collectively we're supporting a much more wholesome, ecologically just, nature enriched world? And what are the things that we can, how do we find our role, our place? Becoming crew isn't for me about just becoming one of the drones and showing up in uniform. Actually, it's not. It's about finding your sublime role within the tapestry of community, of what you can bring or what you carry, but also how you are there as creating a sense of the container and also the vessel and the support network. That's what I think it is. I think it's about care and duty, where arms are open up for each other and
thinking about others' needs. I grew up in an organization called Forest School Camps, which is very, very Bristol focused. And there's always been that concept that I've grown up with them, which is that if you take care of everybody else's needs, your needs in turn will be looked after. And I've always been very nourished by that, because it's something that I see is such a healthier way of existing if we're thinking about our fellow brothers and sisters and community. Actually, we are so looked after. So that's what I think becoming crew means.
And finally, let's hear from Immy Kaur at Civic Square.
So listen, honesty is important. Getting started is important. Looking after each other is important in this. Humanizing and dignifying ourselves and creating demons of the extractive systems that are killing us is important. And to know that there is a whole world of beauty and care and love and thoughtfulness and relationship with each other, and the world that even if we don't get to experience all of it, we can move back and towards that. And nothing is so great that we can't turn things around into a different story. And so whoever knows, nobody knows what that tipping point is going to be. Nobody knows what opportunities are going to be there. But in every way, we have to be ready and mobile and not passive and thoughtful and creative within that. And I think it's so important to keep reminding ourselves of these stories every day, right? Especially, like I said last time, if you listen to this podcast, no matter what it feels like, no matter what your circumstances are, no matter what your tensions are, you're right up there. You're right up there with people who have the most amount of agency. And sometimes that can just be divesting from a world and a system, a story, a boycott, a way you spend your money, a conversation you have, all the way to spending your entire life trying to build this type of work. And never ever, like Kavita said, don't think that you don't have a role, and that role can change, and it doesn't have to be like everybody else's role. But do not be passive to this story, because our generation has huge amounts of spiritual, social, practical work to do. But I still, if I didn't wake up every day believing it wasn't absolutely possible, and I wasn't surrounded and seeing stories of both the horror but the resilience and resistance, for example, of the Palestinian people right now, I literally think we have a whole world beyond this, and we have to fight with every last morsel of energy, because there's so much to gain, and it's so important that we do.
So, thank you for listening. I really hope you've received through this and enjoyed this annual experiment. Please let us know if you have. We deeply appreciate your support, so a massive thank you to all our listeners this year. To our group of paid subscribers on Substack, thank you so much for your ongoing commitment and belief in the project. I want to offer massive gratitude and respect to all our guests on the podcast this year, to all our guest teachers on our events, gatherings and courses, to everyone who has shared, reviewed, rated, commented, left us messages. Thank you. It really does mean something to hear from you, and it helps others to find us. So please do share this if you're receiving something. Send it to a friend, give us a review, send us a message, post it on your socials, flip to a paid subscription at becomingcrew.substack.com if you have the financial means. And if you're someone who has interest in sponsoring or funding the podcast in 2025, please do reach out. Drop us a mail, hello@thespaceship.earth. And finally, a massive shout out to the crews, to the podcast crew, Charlie Shred, Louise Romain, Seema Nahome Burgess, Willow Burgess, Finn Burgess. Yes, we're a family affair. Thank you all for your energy, creativity, resourcefulness, patience, and ability to work with my emergent and divergent ways. A huge shout out to the Becoming Crew Basecamp Collective, Eva Semenovic, Mark Sears, Mark DeLissa, Kamara Venner, Seema. So much beauty, wonder and service you all bring to these times. And to the growing community who continue to gather for our live sessions, our open spaces and our Wheel of the Year gatherings. You all give so much in your unique, beautiful ways of showing up and all that you are. So if you would like to get involved with any of our offerings next year, check out the website, sign up to the Substack as the best ways to stay in the loop. We're going to go into a short hibernation to compost ourselves in the darkness and to plant some seeds for the year ahead. We'll be back sometime around Imbolc, I imagine. Look after yourselves and each other out there. Keep entangling and becoming with this extraordinary spaceship Earth we call home, and keep carrying the love, being the peace, becoming the change. We're going to play out with some words from Dr. Wallace J. Nichols, marine biologist and author of the seminal book Blue Mind, from an episode 44 back in 2021. Jay tragically left this realm in 2024. He was the most humble human who gave so much to widening our collective understanding of the human entanglement and interdependence with the waters of this earth. To see beyond water as just a resource to be protected, but a sacred flow of life itself, so entangled with human and planetary health and our emotional regulation and well-being. So, until next time, peace and out.
This podcast is created in service to life, for you. It takes time, funds and energy to make. If you'd like to contribute to the running costs, you can donate the price of a cuppa or a pint. Find the link on our website. This podcast wouldn't exist without the following crew: Charlie Shred, Audio Jedi; Seema Nahome Burgess, Engine Room; Willow Burgess, Jingles.
Yeah, we've shared, just as a way of instigating conversation, we've shared millions of blue marbles with people. They're just recycled glass, azure blue marbles. And when you hold them at arm's length, they remind us what we look like from a million miles away. We sort of did the math. And as you move away from Earth, you see it as a blue sphere because of the water. And it's a small one. And our spaceship Earth is a small, watery one. And it's precious and it's beautiful. And we're so lucky. And I think this pandemic has reminded a lot of people of that, how connected we are and how interdependent we are. We really do need each other for everything. And that perspective, that backing off a million miles and looking back at our home. It's mostly astronauts who get to do that. So if you get a blue marble, it's a proxy for being an astronaut, I suppose. But it's a humbling perspective, and everyone who has seen Spaceship Earth from a distance comes back utterly transformed from that view. And I think that's something maybe people can keep in mind, that we really are that little blue marble in space, and the water is so important.